Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for all being here tonight with us. On behalf of the FIU Center for Leadership and the Chapman family, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Alvah H. Chapman Jr. Leadership Lecture. We are overwhelmed by the response to this event and honored to have you all here with us tonight. The Chapman Leadership Lecture was developed to feature a distinguished, transcendent leader each year, someone who's making a difference with their organization and in the community that they serve and beyond. This lecture is a fitting tribute to Alvah H. Chapman Jr., who was one of South Florida's most influential business and civic leaders. At this time, I'd like to ask that the Chapman family stand for a moment of recognition for their support of FIU and the community at large. Betty Chapman, Alvah's wife, Dale Chapman Webb, Alvah's daughter, and Aubrey Webb, Alvah's grandson. Thank you. I'd also like to recognize some of the other leaders in our community who are present tonight. Founding Chairman of the FIU Board of Trustees, Armando Codina, and the other members of the FIU Board of Trustees present tonight. Thank you for being here. Chairman of the Center for Leadership Board of Advisors, Dr. Nelson Adams, and the other members of the Center's Board of Advisors present tonight. Thank you all for being here. Chairman of the Chapman Partnership for the Homeless, Trish Bell, and other members of the Chapman Partnership Board. Thank you all for being here. We're pleased also to have with us the Executive Dean of the College of Business Administration, Joyce Elam, and the Dean Designate, David Klock. Thank you both. At this time, it is my privilege to introduce you to Modesto Mitch Madi, former president of FIU for almost a quarter of a century, President Emeritus, and the Alvah H. Chapman Jr. Chair in Leadership. Mitch.
I don't know what's happening at the Miami Herald without David Landsberg being there, so we really appreciate your, basically paralyzing the newspaper to come here to listen to probably, the icon of publishers, David Lawrence. I'd like to add my welcome. We're really thrilled to be here. This is the lecture of all the lectures we've had that has drawn the largest turnout and a very good grouping of the leaders, in our community. In everybody's life, there are moments. There are moments that will shape you forever in the future. And you only hope that in those moments, when there are forks in the road, when there's a choice between two paths, you either have the wisdom to make the right choice, or you have someone who can advise you, who can counsel you on what that right choice is. I'm going to begin tonight by telling you how Alvah Chapman influenced one of those decisions in my own life. He understood very, very well what it is to make such decisions. In 1988, I was 2 years into my presidency at FIU when a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity came. Both the Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, and Jeb Bush, who was to become, soon thereafter become governor, called me because they had nominated me to be Secretary of Education of the United States. This would have been a signal honor and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I scheduled a visit with Alvah Chapman, then chairman of our Foundation Board of Trustees, to discuss the situation. I was, with some trepidation, considering the opportunity. It would have been a tremendous honor to become the first Hispanic cabinet member in the history of the United States. The signals I had received from the White House were that I had a good chance of being appointed. On the other hand, I had publicly indicated to the search committee at FIU that I planned to stay at FIU for the average term of a public university president, about 5 years. I was only 2 years into the job. Alvah, of course, understood all of this. I hung up the phone and told him, that I wanted to come up and talk to him. And I said, Alvah, I have to make a decision as to whether I should consider this job or not. What do you think? Alvah, in his cryptic, unique way, had only this to say. When you became president of FIU 2 years ago, you promised the community that you would do the job for at least 5 years. The only decision you have to make, Mitch, is whether you're going to be true to your commitment. And just like that, Alvah cut right through the puffery that came along with being courted for a Washington cabinet post, the honor of having been called by the head of personnel, of the White House, the thought that I could be the first Hispanic to serve in the cabinet of the United States. Alvah always zeroed in on the heart of the matter. I knew what I had to do. I asked to borrow the phone in the office next to him, the office of his great protege, my former student, Jim Batten, and I called the White House, and to their consternation, I said, remove me from the list. I don't want to be considered. Had this meeting with Alvah not taken place, my life over the following quarter century, and probably also FIU's trajectory, might have turned out very, very differently. That is the kind of quiet impact that Alvah Chapman had on so many in this community, and certainly on my life. You can see perhaps why I felt so privileged to count Alvah Chapman as a mentor and as a friend. I'm also honored to count Betty Chapman as my friend. Alvah was, as all of you know, the captain of the ship. But who was Betty? Ask Alvah, and he would tell you, she's the admiral. This lecture series today is inspired by a man who embodied the rarest form of leadership, one that combines superior talent with an unfailing moral compass. It's not easy for leaders in the context of so many pressures, so many tensions, to discern what the right thing to do is and then to do it. Alvah consistently did it, and I believe it was because he was guided by God and he was guided by his personal honor code. A graduate of the Citadel and a World War II hero, Alvah came from a generation where a man's word was enough. It was an old-fashioned way of doing business, but with Alvah, it was better than any contract you could sign, that is his word. I believe that is why Alvah was trusted, even by men who trust no one. In a few moments, we'll play a video about the things that Alvah did for South Florida, for America, from his years of service to his country, years of service to FIU, working on behalf of the homeless, the post-Andrew rebuilding campaign. Our community and our country owes him a significant debt of gratitude. Tonight, I ask you to go even further and contemplate not just the outcomes of Alvah's activities, but also the values and the motivations of transcendent leadership that are illustrated by the life of Alvah Chapman. Now, let's take a look at a video on Alvah's life.
When Alvah and I were in Utah at Brigham Young University, and he was making a speech to a large auditorium filled with students. And he made his speech, and then there was the question and answer period. And this young man got up in the back of the room, held up his hand. He said, "Mr. Chapman, I want to know what are the 3 or 4 things you would contribute your success to." And I think Alvah was a little taken back, but he thought, and he said, first, he said, number 1, it's my faith. Number 2, it's my happy marriage. Number 3, my family. And number 4, my training at the Citadel.
When Alvah finished his tour of duty as a bomber pilot and squadron commander in World War II, he signed up. He didn't have to. He signed up for another 25 missions. Before those 25 were completed, the war was won. But he wasn't one to say, okay, I've done my duty, it's all over, thank you very much. He signed up again. Alvah had a very strong sense of honor and duty from his experience at the Citadel.
Well, I suppose the two words greatest generation have become so overused that we shouldn't use them anymore, but I'm going to use it one more time. This is a man flying bomber missions over Europe with a huge mortality rate, surviving, coming back home, and then expressing that kind of leadership that he did in his early 20s for the next 60 years.
As he got older and was more and more and more successful, he'd built a great company, Knight Ridder, which he brought together, Knight and Ridder, and then for, I think it was 17 years, he had 13% compounded earnings, an extraordinary record.
When we moved here, and he was going up on the expressway, and he saw people living in cardboard boxes, he said, Betty, we've got to do something about this. He wanted to do more than feed and clothe them. He wanted to see that they could move on to a better life.
Alvah lived his Christian faith. He felt from his core that he was his brother's keeper.
You know, something else that defined Alvah was his sense of family, and certainly his own personal family. I mean, Betty was his partner in everything, as he used to say, and his angel. He always liked to use the analogy of angels, and there was no greater angel for Alvah than Betty, and they were wonderful partners. But his family was always very important to him, but that concept of family that he personally had also demonstrated itself or illustrated itself in the broader community.
After Hurricane Andrew, that President Bush, the elder President Bush, announced on national TV that they were appointing Alvah to be the head of the organization that was going to work to rebuild Miami-Dade County. And Mr. Chapman was not expecting that to be announced right at that time. They had to just put in a whole bank of telephones and just grab people from everywhere to start answering them. And in the middle of all this craziness, Mr. Chapman was as calm as could be. He walked into this new office where he was going to be sitting, and he sat down and he started making those telephone calls. He started figuring out his plan. How are we going to make this happen?
No, I think Alvah is without a doubt the number one citizen of Miami in modern times. So after Henry Flagler and Julia Tuttle and the wave of people that first came, Alvah, without a doubt, it's no one is contributed like Alvah has.
Alvah, in this community, put FIU on the map. Alvah joined our board, and he is the longest-serving chairman of the FIU Foundation Board of Trustees. During that time, he helped us to get fundraising going.
At one point, he called up and asked Armando and me to co-chair a project, a big project for the Community Partnership for the Homeless. And I said, well, Alvah, I said, isn't it typical of you that you get some of the busiest people in town and you make them come over and do what you want to do? And he said, by now he had a very soft voice, and he said, oh, no. He said, I don't want you to do what I want to do. I want you to do what your own true interest is. And I've got to tell you, if you didn't know him, you have to understand, he absolutely meant it. He wanted you to pray. He had prayed on this, and he had realized this was in your own true interest. It's absolutely fantastic. The sincerity of it, the steel-willed nature of it, it really accounts for so much of that amazing man's success.
If there's someone in our community, present or past, the last 50 years, which is what I am used to, that deserves the title or deserves the moniker of great man, great leader, it is Alvah Chapman.
He was one of a kind.
So my answer is God and Betty. Without the two, we'd have no Alvah Chapman.
Alvah was a man of faith. He was active in our church. Through the years, he was a Sunday school teacher. He served on boards, committees, and he was a firm believer. And we were blessed to have 65 years of happiness together. As busy as he was, he always had time to share time with his family.
By the way, this video was put together entirely by our own staff in order to make it more economical, and I think they did a terrific job. Any of you here that worked on the video? Anybody here? Well, Sandy Gonzalez-Levy heads external relations, and this was done by them. I guess they're busy working on another video, is the only thing I can. An important part of Alvah's legacy is the quiet way he helped shape the next generation of leaders in South Florida. He advised, he inspired many, including tonight's speaker, David Lawrence, the retired publisher of the Miami Herald and current leader of the children's movement of Florida. Through his own example, Alvah taught me, David Lawrence, Armando Cadena, Alberto Ibargüen, Daniel and Trish Bell, David Landsberg, Joe Natoli, and many others that giving back to the community was an integral part of leading, not something else. Alvah was a fearless advocate for the causes he supported, and he had the ability to convince others to join him. More than one South Florida businessman became a philanthropist under Alvah's tutelage. I'll tell you a quick story that illustrates that. The first major fundraising expedition that FIU did was to the Ryder Corporation. We asked them for $2 million. I was with Alvah, we made the case, and as we're walking out, Alvah told Tony Burns, who was then the president and CEO of the Ryder Corporation, the Ryder Systems. He said, Tony, I hope you'll give very strong consideration to this request, because if you say no, we're coming back to ask for $4 million. We got the $2 million. And Tony felt the way that Armando, says he feels that Alvah was a very expensive friend, because he always, had you committing to some aspect or some organization. Another example is we went to see Amancio Suarez. And Amancio is, if you can imagine, those of you that are not Cuban, a Cuban good old boy, because a Cuban good old boy is a little different than a good old boy in the south of the United States. And Amancio asked him, Alvah, I'm going to do whatever you do. And Alvah says, I'm giving $1 million. Amancio says, I give $1 million too. So that was, Alvah led by example. All along the way, through his own civic activities and those of his proteges, Alvah helped to build a better community in South Florida and the country at large. David Lawrence has done the same through his commitment to improving education for Florida's children. The children's movement seeks nothing less than making children the state's top priority. In 2002, David did the unimaginable. He led a statewide effort to establish Florida's voluntary pre-education program Since then, thousands upon thousands of 4-year-olds have had the opportunity to jumpstart their education at a critical time of early childhood development. Many in this room are educators or want to be educators. We know David's vision is vital for the future of our community, our state, and our country. During his impressive journalism career, David led daily newspapers around the country. While he was publisher of the Miami Herald earned 5 Pulitzer Prizes. During his 10 years published, journalists like to say that their role is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And based on my own experience, I can say that David Lawrence does do that. This is what he has done throughout his career and continues to do as he speaks out on behalf of children. I know, because I knew Alvah fairly well, that he would be proud to see his friend and mentee as the inaugural speaker of the Chapman Leadership Lecture Series. Let's give a warm welcome to David Lawrence.
Thank you, Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here. Privileged to be here to speak in the memory and example of this community's singularly great leader of the past half-century. To do so with his beloved Betty and daughter Dale and grandson Bray in the audience. And Alvah would be the first to say that none of us achieves anything alone. Betty Chapman is my very favorite example of a supportive, collaborative partner. She reminds me to be truthful of my own mother, short in stature and great in goodness. In my own growing up years, all 9 of us Lawrence children would have told you that my father was the strong man in our family. But then we discovered in my mother's widowhood of 20 years that maybe she was the strong one in the family. Full of extraordinary faith, the greatest values. And I would tell you that is Betty Bates Chapman. I love and admire her deeply. Alvah H. Chapman Jr. and his leadership is the theme of this evening. I spoke to that as his funeral service now almost 4 years ago. About the life he built from the greatest lessons of the Bible, his appetite for plain speaking nurtured by compassion and fairness, his extraordinary understanding of the difference between right and wrong, his insistent efforts on behalf of the least, the last, and the lost in our midst. And I promise you to say that Alvah Chapman was strong-willed would be to deeply understate the matter. In my almost 4 decades of knowing Alvah Chapman, I promise you that if Alvah Chapman decided that far wall needed to go down by the morning and it needed to be done by telepathy, somehow it would be down. I promise you. I'm not Alvah Chapman. None of us is. But each of us does have within us the power to get things done. Good things, meaningful things, things that, to use Mitch's word, transcend our lifetimes. What I'm going to share with you tonight is going to be laced throughout with the personal, because what I share is what I have learned in life. I grew up on a farm, a chicken farm, which I promise you is the least glamorous form of farming in the United States of America. If I know how to work hard, and I do, it's because of that. By the time I was 9 years old, I was driving a tractor and selling vegetables to neighbors. 5 days a week before we were picked up by the school bus on the dirt road in front of our home, the older children, of which I am number 2, helped slaughter and gut and dress chickens, that in turn were sold to area grocery stores. We did not have supermarkets. We didn't have a lot of money, but we never considered ourselves poor. Dinner time, all of us around the table, was presided over by my father, who quizzed us on the news of the day and politics and government generally. We had a newspaper at home every day but Sunday, when we had 2 newspapers. We were never brought up to believe that we were better than anyone else, but we were brought up to believe that we had an obligation to make something of ourselves. I can remember my father warning us about trying to save the world, but I can also remember he and my mother emphasizing to all 9 of us that we were very much obliged to make a difference in the world, and certainly not only for ourselves, but for those who were less fortunate than we. And every single night at 8 o'clock, we all knelt down for prayers. Reading is going to be fundamental to what I'm sharing this evening because it is so central to what I would want to be and what difference I might be able to make and to what I would want for every child. If I go back 2/3 of a century to when I was age 4, I can remember my mother reading The Little Engine That Could. If you'll recall, it goes, I think I can, and then it turned out that the little engine could, which seems to me a metaphor for the possibilities within each of us. I started first grade. We didn't have kindergarten where I lived with Dick and Jane. Books came every Christmas as principal gifts. In 1953, when I was 11, my parents bought a whole set of the World Book Encyclopedia. We children looked things up, but we also read the encyclopedia, page after page, because learning was fun. Seemingly all my life, I've read a book or more every week. In 35 years at 7 newspapers, reading gave me more insightful questions and fuller understanding. It gave me the confidence to interview the likes of the dictator of Cuba and the President of the United States. It has led me to more meaningful conversations and more meaningful relationships. And what I have read most of all have been biographies and histories, especially American histories. And in recent years, I've come to think I ought to read more literature, and I promise you I'm not talking about James Patterson or Danielle Steele, or for that matter, Shades of Grey. More likely it would be the likes of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or something by Mark Twain, a man I love because he grew so much all his life. Mr. Twain makes me smile and think, and both are important. Reading is a connector, often in ways I might never have imagined when I picked up the book. And so a few weeks ago, because I had never read it before, I read Great Expectations, written literally a century and a half ago, wherein Charles Dickens tells the story of a boy who grew up to be a man, a boy called Pip, who was raised by his much older and much bigger and big bully sister. And here's a paragraph in which Pip speaks, reminding us that the basics are timeless. Quote, "My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice that the child can be exposed to, but the child is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high, according to scale, as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself, I had sustained from my babyhood a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known from the time I could speak that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Charles Dickens, 150 years ago. My own lifelong sense of justice and injustice, fairness and unfairness, continues to be deeply informed by my reading. God and family and good teachers have given me the lifelong capacity to become interested in, frankly, just about anything. Reading deepens my understanding of what has gone wrong in the world and what has gone right, and who has done good and who has done bad, and why. Every one of us needs role models. I find them many places, including all the time on the printed page. The best leaders I've ever known are eager to learn from the past. Sadly and painfully, in my estimation, we live in times when so many Americans have precious little respect for and understanding of the lessons of history. So if you go to this state's FCAT, for instance, you'll find no section on history, meaning, I suppose, that the state has decided that history is not important enough. And if that be so, it is short-sighted stupidity. These days, it seems to me, too many people make up their minds that what has happened heretofore was a very long time ago and hence not very meaningful now. In our own home, beyond books, my wife and I read 2 newspapers a day. I frankly don't like to go to work without knowing what is happening, particularly in my own community. And frankly, all the time I say, with the deepest respect to David Landsberg, whom I've worked with for 10 years, a truly fine human being. All the while I worry about the erosion of real journalism in print, worry because there's so much we should know that we would not know if the Miami Herald didn't tell us. And to be honest, we live in times when too many people think they're informed if they get a snippet on the BlackBerry or a cable TV rant described and labeled as news. That I lead an optimistic and idealistic life is among my greatest blessings. So too is the fact that I lead a mostly simple life and that I appreciate and love my wife, Roberta, even more than we were married back in December of 1963. And truth to tell, if she and our 5 children and our grandchildren and their families are all right, I'm basically all right. For both of us, reading good books is among the great joys of life. Now, some of you won't be surprised to know that people not infrequently suggest I slow down. Others use this perfectly horrific word called retirement. And I think it's probably true that I ought to slow down a bit. But retirement seems to me, as I think it seems to Mitch Medic, something fairly unhealthy and unwise. To be straightforward, there's simply too much I like to do, and I'm not saving my energy for the next world. And I will acknowledge being driven, but I will bristle if you label me a workaholic. Truth to tell, I never wanted to miss a day of work in my life, and I haven't. I never thought it was work. To this very day, I remain driven by an eagerness to learn, driven by what remains to be done, driven by injustices and inequity. I also tell you that I think I had my priorities straight enough to be sure that any events with our children, sports or plays or anything, were on my calendar and attended. What I've shared to this point, I promise you speaks directly to tonight's topic and yours and my ability to further human progress here or anywhere. And I'm going to use another word, love. It's a word that so many people, especially men, hesitate to use. But I increasingly use that word. The fact of the matter is that each of us needs to be respected, wanted, needed, fulfilled, and I would add loved. Love, in fact, is an extraordinary motivator. I was managing editor of a newspaper, daily newspaper, by the time I was 27, which I promise you was too young, and thus my management style was mostly ordering people to do certain things. As I learned subsequently and quickly, it was a particularly dumb way to motivate anyone. A kind word is a powerful motivator. One of the greatest examples of anyone I ever knew was Jim Batten, a master of the kind word. I was struck in this spirit by a funeral notice I read 10 days ago in the Miami Herald. A woman named Marge Hartnett had died. She was 95 years old. I had knew her and admired her for years, and if you read the death notice, in the closing words, she made it clear that she would have no memorial service or funeral. Instead, she wrote this: "Please do something nice for someone who doesn't get much attention." Now, I would tell you that's genuine wisdom. Most of my love is for people, but I also love Miami without suggesting it is the single easiest place we've ever lived. I love Miami because of what we are and what we can be. Love Miami because a newcomer can do anything here. Unlike anywhere else we've ever lived, you don't have to wait for years to pitch in to help. Indeed, you don't have to wait at all. Which is why I say a bit painfully, reading the Herald story on Sunday about the Miami Foundation's report on the low level of community involvement here was disconcerting and discombobulating to me. I love Miami because, in my estimation, it's the biggest small town in the United States of America. My advice frequently to people is avoid insulting anyone here, because within 18 hours you may well find out that you have insulted someone's close friend or relative. I promise you I've seen this for years. I love Miami because we're on the cutting edge of American pluralism. And we have the capacity to preview for the rest of the country, by some example, how the diverse people of one community can learn about and from one another, come to understand and respect our differences, celebrate what we have in common, and do a lot of good things together. It would be unwise of me to get carried away with how good and special we are in Miami, because I have no sense we have yet arrived at the promised land. And I give you two examples of what worries me mightily in my own community. For one example, good people are increasingly not putting themselves up for public service, nor encouraging and helping other people to run for office. My gosh, what a mistake for the future of this community. Now, I say the following 2 or 3 sentences with a little risk, and I don't want to be insensitive to anyone. But I'll bet I have read as much about Cuban history as most people in this room. And I came to the conclusion, and I've talked to people like Mitch Medic about this, to make sure that I'm not wildly off base. But what I have read and what I have heard from people about the history of Cuba gives me the understanding that too many good people decided politics was dirty, and therefore You don't get involved in politics. And what's the result? Machado, Batista, Castro. I'm not making the slightest point here about the history of Cuba. I'm rather giving you what I regard to be the lessons of history for all of us. And my deepest concern that the ethos of unselfish and elected public service is being diminished in our own community and in our own country by many factors. And number two, we lead far too separate lives. This sense of Miami as melting pot seems to me, to be honest, pretty ludicrous. We're not a melting pot. And indeed, this country is not a melting pot. At our best, we might be a tasty salad in a bowl. And so I would ask you in the simplest possible way, I would ask each of us to ask ourselves, whom did I have in my home in the past year? We talk an extraordinary game of diversity in this community, and I think it is an honest emotion. Yet too often, we remain most comfortable with people like ourselves. And I would say the lessons of history are that to confront that and serve as a genuine example to America, I have to confront myself and you have to confront yourself as well. Mitch told you that my focus for a good number of years now has been children, especially in the early learning years when 90% of brain growth comes to pass. I have come to believe, undergirded by research, that the smartest possible investment we could make in the future of our beloved country is to get children off to a good start in life and in school. It profoundly worries me that we are slipping in profoundly significant ways as a country, most particularly in being genuinely educated. In a country where 90% of all children go to public school, as I did, what does it say about ourselves that 44% of the third grade students in the state of Florida are poor readers or cannot read at all? What does it say about us that 3 out of every 4 17 to 24-year-olds in the United States of America cannot enter the American military because they have an academic problem, a physical problem, a criminal justice problem, or a substance abuse problem? My gosh, this is a threat to the national security of the United States of America. So built from those realities, propelled by the drive and visions I have heretofore described, I spend most of my energies on the imperative of school readiness, high-quality early care development and education. And as Mitch told you, from that vision, accompanied by evidence and energy, has come the passage of a constitutional amendment so that every 4-year-old in this state is entitled to pre-kindergarten for free. It's worth your knowing that Florida is one of only 3 states in the country that do this, and 175,000 4-year-olds are in the program this year. From that same vision, we made the case for the children's trust in our own community, meaning this year alone, an extra $123 million is being invested in high-quality early intervention and prevention. So we can be a cynical community sometimes, right? And yet the people of this community decided to raise their own taxes twice for other people's children. And it's from that vision that we've been trying to build the children's movement of Florida and already have 325,000 followers in this state. And I promise you, in my own soul and in my own vision and in my own philosophy, accompanying all the research and the intellectual underpinnings of this work is old-fashioned outrage. Think about it. All social progress in history has its roots in outrage. The sort of outrage that led to women having the right to vote, to Social Security in 1935, to Medicare in 1965, to the civil rights and feminist movements. The sort of outrage that ought to remind us, for example, of the idiocy, the illogic of our state using our money to spend a piddling $2,383 on a pre-K slot, and 21 times that, or $50,000, to incarcerate a juvenile. Wow, we got to be smarter than that. One of my favorite columnists is the New York Times' David Brooks, who warns us that the problem is not that America lacks resources, the problem is that they're misallocated. And I don't say this politically either. But I want you to know by way of example that we have figured out how to spend $500 billion in the last 11 years to bring democracy to Afghanistan. I'm not even counting Iraq here. Might be a noble cause. It's one not likely to succeed. And then at the same time that we can gather those resources to do those kinds of things, 12, 13 million children have no health insurance. And at the same time, in the richest, most generous country on the face of the earth, 46 million Americans live in the full definition of poverty. My God, we got to be a better country than this. I want you to remember, as we struggle over so-called Obamacare and other matters, history tells us what seems radical in one generation becomes the foundation of American equity in the next. No progress in human history, I would argue, has been achieved, with the exception of science and medicine, with anything less than vision accompanied by courage combined with pushing and shoving. I love people of goodwill and think I generally am. But progress requires as well insistent, sometimes unpleasant energy. And what George Bernard Shaw told us 80 years ago, needed more unreasonable people. The great American Frederick Douglass told us, quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." It's, of course, nigh unto impossible to know where you are in history when you're living it. One of the books I remember from my high school years in Bradenton, Florida, was Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. 500 years ago, he told us, quote, "There is nothing more difficult to conduct or more uncertain of success than to take the lead in the introduction of the new order of things." And I would tell you, and I am sad to report this, that doing right by children remains a mission barely begun, and frankly ought to be central to the new order of things. I don't know what could be more American than that every child have the real opportunity to succeed in school and in life. I can promise you that the children of Miami and America are nowhere close to being a real and major priority. I also tell you that the exact same principles of health and education and nurturing and love that our 5 children received, and now their children, deserve to be the fundamentals for all children in a society that seeks to be good as well as wise. That, I promise you, is not socialism. It's American. To achieve the best for Miami and America requires an insistence on justice for all. It means you and I need to speak up far more often than most of us do. It means each of us ought to keep the pulpit available to everyone. I'm certainly not advocating the crude, angry, I can outshout you voices that pass these days for public discourse on blogs and broadcast. But I absolutely do mean that we citizens need to be speaking up more about what we think is right and good. It seems to be more rare than ever for our elected leaders in Miami and Tallahassee and Washington to use their platforms to teach and inspire, as my very favorite president, Abraham Lincoln, did to the nation's greatest benefit. We all need inspiration. And what I say now is not meant in the slightest way to be political, but only used as an example. My single greatest disappointment with our current president is a failure to use that pulpit as he did so remarkably 4 years ago. The best speech I've heard on race in the last 35 years came from candidate Obama in Philadelphia back in 2008, and if you've never read it, go back and read it. It's powerful and important. We live in a country that needs more speaking up wisdom and much more inspiration. The best leaders I've ever known are teachers and words and example. I'm just like you. I have no real power except the power of oneself, the capacity to convene good people to move toward common cause, blended with vision, and the ability to build collaborative relationships and to raise resources. Power at its wisest is deeply invested in values, accompanied by energetic, insistent purposefulness and a bucket full of common sense. The best leaders I've known are comfortable with and, in fact, eager for inclusiveness. Gathering the fullest range of perspectives and people leads to better decisions if, and I realize this is a very big if there is a real willingness to listen, especially to those who might tell us what we prefer not to hear. So how is each of us willing to use power, and for what purpose, what good? How can each of us depart this world with it in at least a bit better shape than when we entered it? And how will we encourage those who follow us to set their own examples to benefit the generations beyond? I truly love what the great educator Horace Mann advised graduates of Antioch College back in 1859. Be ashamed to die before you have won some battle for humanity. Alvah Chapman, may we always remember, won so many great battles. Alvah was a man of genuine humility, and at the same time deeply purposeful in every chapter in his life. Growing up, leading a B-17 bomber squadron through flak-filled skies over Europe in the Second World War. In his and Betty's decision to marry and love each other all the days of their lives together, and indeed beyond. In raising a family of the highest human values. In insisting on the empowering linkage of sound business principles and first-rate journalism. In his nationally important leadership in diminishing the allure and use of drugs, as well as what he did for the homeless that has since become the national illustration of best practice. The Alvah Chapman I know made a difference in small and kind ways and big and good ways and ways that far transcend any of our generations. You and I have no less an opportunity. A century and a half ago, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, told us, if I were to wish for anything, I should not wish for wealth and power, but for the passionate sense of the potential, for the eye ever young and ardent that sees the possible. That, it seems to me, was Alvah Chapman. And it is in that spirit that I have such great faith in what you and I, indeed, each of us, can do and will do. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's enough. Get them settled down. All right. Thank you.
I want to thank Dave for sharing those incredibly thought-provoking ideas with us. I think it's just outstanding, an incredible model of leadership. I want to thank him for years of modeling great leadership to those of us that worked in the Miami Herald and now in this incredible mission that he's on in what he knows is right and what we know is right. I can tell you also, just to clarify one thing from Dave's talk, is that Dave Lawrence's stoplight of life has no yellow or red on it, okay? I can tell you that firsthand. There is only green for go. And at this time, we have an opportunity to take questions for Dave. They're setting up microphones on the aisleway, so go ahead and step up.
Can I get you all to do one other thing? Saturday is Betty Chapman's birthday. She'll be 92, and I want you to sing happy birthday to her. Ready?
All right.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Betty. Happy birthday to you.
All right, come on, don't be shy. Step up to the microphone. Let's have a couple questions for Dave. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you for your wonderful speech. My question for you is, what do you think we can do to prepare for the next generation of public servants, for exceptional public servants?
The next generation of
Exceptional public servants.
exceptional?
Public servants.
No, I got it.
Dave, can you repeat the question?
I am elderly but unwilling to reveal my age. My God, I see young people all the time who just inspire me. There are wonderful people in the Miami-Dade public school system who are students here, 350,000 of them. Many of them are sensational human beings, so there are lots of good people. But I wish we would come together more as a community to celebrate the best public service. I see Katie Sorensen here, a county commissioner I admire deeply, who's now running a good government. Is that what it is? But here was an example of a person who unselfishly, in my estimation, she wasn't always right, and she may have been a little persnickety at times. But I need to be inspired by good people, and there are not enough good people in elected public office in this community, and for that matter, this state. And what I see happening is so many young people checking out saying, "Tell me when it is over." You know, the great era of public service to some degree began with people like the Harrimans, who came out of a robber baron tradition. But Averill Harriman and his sister, there was an ethos that lasted for decade upon decade in this country where people went to college so they could contribute to their country. And the other thing I'd say is, if you don't read, you don't know a hell of a lot. And the fact of the matter is, if you're not reading history, then you don't know, it doesn't fit together. And Abraham Lincoln, who I mentioned, certainly was a creature of his times and held views that would be abhorrent to us now. But if you go back and read how Abraham Lincoln grew, he always hated slavery, incidentally. Never believed But then most abolitionists didn't believe either that black and white people would be social equals. But he was a stunningly good person. We were terribly blessed by having him at a crucial time in this country. We didn't know what we had before he was elected. It was a very different kind of election for a whole set of reasons. But when I read the World Book Encyclopedia, all 21 volumes, my gosh, I learned about some extraordinary people. And so one of the things I'd say is far beyond simply signing up for a volunteer program is make sure you have the intellectual underpinnings to know what genuine public service is, and it will inform you. And frankly, it will give you the greatest joy you could possibly have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lawrence, thank you for being here, and thank you for being such an inspiration to all of us in our community. I'd like to know, what is the minimum that we can do as parents, busy professionals in our community, to help our local K through 12 education system here in South Florida?
The single most important ingredient in a child's success, teachers are really important, but the single most important ingredient is a caring and knowledgeable parent. I start out with the principle that parents truly love their children, and it is disrespectful and worse to suggest otherwise. Many are incapable. Much of what we know as parents is because we had good role models as parents. We live in a very different and tougher world. We live in a world where 2/3 of women in this country with children between birth and age 5 work outside the home. That was not my generation, I promise you. So it's a different, but I'll give you an example. And much of life is about small things. You have a child. That child is 2. You go grocery shopping. You're at Sedano's or Publix or Winn-Dixie, and you're talking all the way through it. You're talking about shapes and colors and sizes, and this is wings. It means they can fly. Here's what that means. And we're getting 1, 2, 3 of these. Another thing we can do, frankly, this is not an anti-television riff, but the brain needs interactivity. And if it doesn't get it, the synapses wither away. They don't connect. Television is an unactive medium. I'm old enough, and there are others in here who are old enough to remember when Sesame Street was supposed to bring a revolution in raising children. And a little Sesame Street's okay. But what you really need is, even if it's only for a limited time, holding and talking and singing with and having expectations, not praising at every moment a child. I was never praised at every moment, and I think it's an unhealthy way to bring up children. Make sure you got a lot of love and praise in there, but also you have an obligation to teach. And we in this community have 24-hour phone lines in 3 languages and an internet base, and I met recently with the governor and said, you want a home run? Do this statewide with an omnipresent public information campaign. People love to do right by their children. I see our own children. They don't know what to look for in child care. 80% of child care in America is storage and warehousing. How do you tell the difference? There are ways to tell the difference. It's about education.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dave. Thanks for, oh, is this on? Yes?
Pull it
Good
down
evening.
some.
Sorry, I know, I'm so short. Good evening. Thanks for all of your support to FIU. I actually wanted to ask about, given your leadership around the children's movement, what do you think the obstacles are surrounding collective impact models here, specifically for Miami? And what promise do you think endeavors like One Community, One Goal holds?
You might think that because it's children and everybody loves children, and they do, that it's kind of a slam dunk and this would be an easy win. First of all, most people are not aware of what happens in brain growth. They're not aware of the crucial nature. I frequently ask people, when should you start reading with children, and I'll get an age where a child is talking. Need to be doing it way, way, way before then. I'm convinced that if we were smarter, wiser, we would devote so much energy to this topic of early investment that we would see a stunning growth in educated children. If you asked me tomorrow to be a teacher in 4th or 7th or 11th grade, I hope I would make a difference. And many people do. But 30% of the children in this state start school way behind. And then they get further behind. As important as I think 4-year-old pre-K is, I think ages 1, 2, and 3 are much more important. I'll give you a stunning statistic. If you have 100 children at the end of 1st grade who are lousy readers, at the end of 4th grade, 88 of them are still lousy readers. It's very, very difficult to catch kids up. Not impossible, very difficult. If you want public education reform in the United States of America, you can mumble all you want about vouchers and charters and other things. The main chance is the public school system in this country. So there's room for some other things. But the single smartest thing you could do is to deliver the children in better shape to formal school. So I'm in this community some months ago. I go to a lot of child care, early learning, public schools, etc. And I'm reading to 21 3- and 4-year-olds in a YMCA and an accredited child care center. I'm high on the Y. 21 children, and I'm reading them Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Now, I didn't even know it was a book, but it's a book. And on the front cover is old Mr. MacDonald, and he has red and white check shirt, and he's wearing what I would call overalls, but I think they're not called that anymore. And he had a straw hat, and on the straw hat, 2 bunny ears coming through. Not one of the 21 children knew it was a bunny rabbit, and 2 of them said cow. And any laughter you have or giggling you have or whatever, you ought to be nervous about it. There's a stunning number of children in that shape. If a child comes to kindergarten and 1st grade with momentum, he is going to rock or roll, he or she is going to rock and roll all their lives, chances are. Comes in poor shape, there's a hell of a chance that he'll be in prison someday and not making much money and not paying many taxes to help society and less often owning cars and homes and so forth and so on. The crucial thing is the wisdom to invest early. And one other thing I'd say apropos to your question, because I don't want you to think that it's because it's about children that it's an automatic winner. Lots of you know Janet Reno. 1988, she was the state attorney of Miami, of then what was called Dade County. A really good human being. Believed deeply in this subject. Tried to pass an issue, exactly what became the Children's Trust. Argued fundamentally, you've got to help the kids over here and over here and over here. It failed 2-1. In 2002, when we passed it, we ran a political campaign, raised a great deal of money, and had a vision that it was about everyone's child. Understanding at the same time that certain children need more. But you can't build a movement when it's about those children. You have to build a movement when it's about our children. Okay?
Mr. Lawrence, thank you for your compelling presentation and lecture. My name is Nawagi Yama. I'm a director of the FIU Foundation. My question to
And
you
you
is
have a
about-
check for me of some sort? Okay. Doesn't work that way, does it? Okay.
My question to you is at the other end of the spectrum. I have a son that's in that category that range between 20 and 30 years old. I don't know if they're called millennials, but I have an opportunity to talk to a lot of his friends and try to mentor him, give him advice. And I have been very distraught by something that you sort of touched on. It has to do with perspective and history. And that generation that I talk to a great deal every day seems to be very bleak on America, very bleak on this country, very bleak on opportunity, on jobs. And they just think that, I guess since 9/11 through forward, that this country's never going to get better. It's never going to have anything positive. They're not going to find good jobs, et cetera, et cetera. That our generation, the baby boomers, probably took everything. And I remind them that history proves us that this country has been in much dire straits, much bigger problems. But you have to study history. You have to remember the panic of 1907 and what that did, and clearly the Depression. And I told them, I said, I specifically am scarred by 1969, even though it was only in third or fourth grade, because this country was in so much turmoil in 1969. And I literally run off everything that happened. And 72, when I had to push my mother's car because we ran out of gas because of the Arab oil embargo. How do we change that attitude of that generation of sort of, let's call it the 10 years, or is that something that time will heal?
Well, it begins with your own responsibility to your own children. That's where it starts, frankly. And the example you set, what kind of life do you live within your own home and so forth? You already know that. I would also say that I told you earlier, I need to be inspired. The great stories of human history, leadership, now Mitch knows more about this subject than I do. I don't think leadership is a team sport. I think extraordinary individuals. We're not honoring the executive committee of Knight Ridder tonight. We're honoring Alvah Chapman, a singularly great leader. My God, there are all sorts of people like that. And so I lead a non-despairing life. I think they're out there. I think it's my obligation and your obligation, frankly, to convince them, show them how to get involved. The beauty of this community is, it wasn't like this when we were in Detroit or Philadelphia or Charlotte or Washington. You come to this community, you can be a participant in anything within the shortest period of time. That's the beauty of this community. We need to encourage more people to get involved. And frankly, as old-fashioned as it sounds, we need more people who read. I'm not talking business books. There's only one kind of business book. It's got the same theme. Maybe there are three. But I don't know what the other two are. Stop reading those things. Read about real people who made a difference rather than some book called Stop, Look, and Live or Smell the Roses Today and Every Day, etc. I still smell the roses, but they have bred most of the smell out of the roses, which really upsets me. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, David. My name is Laura Berger, and I want to go back to the old MacDonald had a farm and the reading that you were doing, and also the fact that you said in order to get anything done, you need to have courage, you need to be pushy, and you need to shove. And so I thought that I would be pushy in suggesting that if you would be open to it, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee because I'd like to discuss with you a program called Read to the Children.
All you need to do is meet up with me afterwards. I'll give you my card, you give me your card, we'll figure it out quickly.
All right.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, Beth.
I'm Beth Harry from the University of Miami, and your speech was just wonderful. Just
Thank
what
you.
we all needed and wanted.
Thank you.
And a comment you made about social media and technology. You made a comment about blogs and tweets. And I want to jump on that and ask you to talk to us a little bit, especially the younger people here who are very comfortable with those media and are growing up with them. Old dinosaurs like you and me, well, we're struggling to learn what they're about. But I'd like you to help us all to think a bit about, we know we can't turn back the clock on technology. but how can we make better use of it so that we can learn how to use it for information and for growth, rather than for sound bites and little meaningless bits of information that I think are designed to put us on stage rather than to communicate. So give us some guidance.
I would say I'm a semi-Luddite in many ways, but the fact of the matter is I use a BlackBerry, a cell phone, a Kindle, and an iPad, and read books that are actually in paper. So I think there is some beauty here. I'll give you one thing. You can't work for me without reading the Miami Herald. You just cannot work for me. Part of it may be pension protection, but but there's more to it than that. It's because I think you're here tonight because you value relationships, you value the community, you understand the world of connections. So you all know Dr. Beth Harry is in charge of teaching and learning at the University of Miami. And she had a little girl named Melanie. And Melanie had cerebral palsy, and at age 6, choked to death. And inspired by what she learned, she has spent the decades since trying to make sure that children with special needs, which is 1 out of every 6 children in America, are not left out of society. They're not ignored. And frankly, to some degree, I think that's a particular problem in this community because culturally, we don't like to tell people we have imperfect children, whatever that means. What was the question, Beth?
The question.
What?
How do you get past all social
Dave,
media and all
thank you for that tribute. Thank you so much. The question was simply whether, and I understand that we all do use these media, but whether we can give the youth some guidance about distinguishing the difference between real learning and real literacy as contrasted with some of what passes, I think, for information through technology.
Yeah, I struggle with this myself with other people. I think an awful lot has to do with, begins with how you raise your own children. I guarantee you we're taking 5 children to Disney World, which is a stunning expense this weekend. 5 grandchildren. And I promise you that before they were 2, they knew what bunny rabbits were. They just did. I worry deeply in this country about haves and have-nots and the growing nature of the gap and the diminishment of the middle class, and it's real and it's happening. The best I can do in this world is, I told you my father said you didn't want us saving the world. And of course he was right. Best I can do is, Beth Harry sets an example, I set an example, Alvah Chapman sets an example, Mitch Medique sets an example, Joe Greer sets an example, Janice Greer in another way sets another example. That's about the best you can do in this world, and then talk to other people. Example is so important. I have a young man who works with me. His name is Vance Aloupis, A-L-O-U-P-I-S, good Greek name. He was the student body president at UM, went to law school there. He's now 29, practiced law for 1.5 years, wanted to make something out of the world. So he came to work for the children's movement. Married to a Brazilian, in the normal Greek-Brazilian cohort in Miami, has an 18-month-old named Isabella, is a stunning father, works his tail off, now reads newspapers, and reads books as well. You couldn't be an intern for me in the summer, we have interns, unless I assign you books. I assign you books about Abraham Lincoln. I give you the book. I assign you a book about the Holocaust. I want you to understand the lessons of history. If more of us did these kinds of things. About Cuba, how much history of Cuba do people who are non-Cuban in this community know? You ought to understand it. There are lessons for all of us in this. Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am. Elaine, I'm sorry.
First, let me start by saying that I loved Alvah Chapman. He was wonderful to me and a mentor to me as a woman running for office for the first time in 1974. He was a man way ahead of his time. And frankly, David, you know how we feel about you. And I'm sure that all the people in the audience now agree with me that you are one of my heroes, too.
Thank you.
In 1974, when I went to Tallahassee, I was very concerned about the fact that people did not really appreciate teachers and therefore did not want to pay them appropriately. Now, this is 38 years later, and I'd like to ask you, what do you think we can do so that when you hear commentators on what's happening in Chicago with the teachers' strike there, and somebody suggests that teachers are getting paid $76,000 a year, which is not true. Whatever it is teachers get paid, they should be getting paid more because they are so important to everything that you're talking about how we raise children. What can we do?
Well, there's a good story in this morning's New York Times about the two principals in the Chicago strike, the head of the union and Rahm Emanuel. These are two deeply volatile human people. So it's worth looking it up if you haven't seen it. I think teachers are used stunningly as a political football, that we blame the ills of society on teachers. Fact of the matter is, parents have a huge obligation. I voted against the class size amendment. That may strike you as heretical, but I voted against it because there's no evidence after third grade that class size is a central dynamic of children learning. What makes it different is how ready that child is to learn, how ready he is or she is, not only cognitively, but also social, emotionally, behaviorally, developmentally, and 1/3 of children in the United States of America in kindergarten can't pay attention in class. You're not going to learn much if you can't pay attention in class. My God, I can tell you 64 years later the name of my first grade teacher, Mrs. Soul. I came from a generation where teachers did not have first names, I don't think. I have never discovered what her name was. She's the only person outside of my own family that I remember from that age. I can tell you the best teachers I've ever had, and you all can do the same, whether it was fourth grade or the second year of law school or whatever else it was. It's that powerful. I so hunger for leadership that is, I think this country works best in the center and not in the right and the left, and that people, we need to figure out how to be more centrist in our thinking and celebrate people, and frankly, the celebration ought to begin with the teachers of America. They didn't go into the business to make money. I didn't go into journalism to make money. I went into it because I thought it might make a difference. You didn't run for the legislature because you were seeking some stipend.
But the teachers need a living wage.
What?
The teachers need a living wage.
I couldn't agree. I could not agree more. Half the teachers are gone from the profession within 5 years of entering it. It's a hell of a problem in the United States. And then all 6 of my sisters became teachers. But that was a time where 5 or 7% of law and medicine were women. Mitch, is it 50% or more at law and medical school at this university? So we're in changed times. I am just, Rahm Emanuel's probably smart as hell. I'm sure he is. Foul-mouthed, but smart as hell. But I don't think you get many places by out-shouting other folks. It doesn't work in Washington. And I'm hungry for the sort of leadership that talks about these kinds of issues and doesn't figure out who's the enemy. Now, I could talk to you about unions. I think unions all organizations tend to atrophy. Could be a university. Could be any institution, unions, management, etc. Unions came to be in America because people couldn't trust management. So management had to change. In many places it has changed. But the problem isn't the union. The problem is real leadership and real civility. And I mean, I'm not saying anything too snarky here. If the governor goes around and has a listening tour, that's great. But you really ought not to close it to the press if you're really serious about telling the story, which is what has happened. We're better people than this. I think Mitch has made the big signal. Have you?
Yeah, let's take one more. And
Okay.
then we
Thank
have
you.
a reception afterwards. We promise you'll take the rest of them in the reception, right?
Okay.
Okay, one more right now.
Good evening. How can those of us who aren't around children every day, how can we contribute to the development of children's readiness? And are there any programs specific to...
Can you read?
Yes.
You a pretty good reader?
Decent.
Okay, so for instance, Carol Barnett, who's a stunning citizen of this state, father-founded Publix, has given us $3 million for a 10-city mentoring program for VPK to grade 3 reading, in which you'll need to contribute 25 hours over the next year. You can't bunch 25 hours in 1 week, 1 hour this week, 1 hour next week, and so forth. How about outcome measurements? My gosh, I bet I could talk to a whole bunch of you. There's stunning ways for people to be involved. I'm giving you one. Give me your card and I'll tell you, or give me your name and whatever.
You're in. You're in.
You're dressed a little in a way that I'm not sure I want you reading. Okay. Let me have your card and I'll call your bluff, okay? Okay. Thank you all very much.
Hang on 1 second. I'm going to invite up Mitch and Betty for a moment, and then we promise we'll bring you right to the reception.
As Betty walks up, let me tell you, every generation has a responsibility to renew itself, to pass on lessons to the next generation. That is why the award that we're going to give Mr. Lawrence today is evocative of a phoenix. A phoenix is a symbol of renewal, of rebirth. And just like Alvah, you may think that Alvah isn't here. Just by Betty being here, you know Alvah is here. But Alvah is here also in the hearts of many of us who were his mentees, who were his proteges, who learned from him and who act in his spirit. And the award, I can't think of a person that more embodies those lessons and that spirit of Alvah than David Lawrence. That's why he is our first speaker and the first recipient of this award.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight, attending, asking great questions. Let's have one more round of applause for Dave Lawrence. And I'd like to invite everybody right next door for a reception starting now. And the extra 4 questions that Dave's going to get.